Welcome back from your break, everyone.
Welcome back.
So this is the part of our peer exchange where I invite you to turn on your cameras and if you're speaking to unmute yourself and contribute to the discussion. So which always goes much more smoothly if you do use the microphone rather than the chat pod, because then we're waiting for people to finish typing. And so first, before we start into the facilitated discussion portion of the session, I wanted to check back in and see if anybody had questions for Mary Beth. That was a really great presentation, Mary Beth. It was as polished as if it had been recorded. And I really enjoyed your, sharing with us the reasons why Connecticut DOT decided to go with or to try certain platforms. I think that's always a question we get, because there's so many different available software and platforms and technologies. Like, how do you choose? What were you looking for? How did you end up going with, whichever system you decided to go with? So thank you for sharing that. So just a quick check, anybody have questions for Mary Beth? Okay, I have a hand raised from Gregory. So go ahead, Gregory.
Yes, hi, good morning, everybody. Greg Sapchinsky with MassDOT here. Just a quick question for Mary Beth. During the presentation, Mary Beth, you mentioned that you provide a link for meeting attendees to take a demographic survey at or after your virtual public events. I'm curious if you have any kind of quick takeaways that you could share about the experience that you have making that kind of demographic survey available, specifically, response rate, and maybe how the response rate differs from in-person meetings in the past to now virtual meetings currently. Or even just kind of public sentiment, if you received any kind of anecdotal information from attendees about, questions about why the survey is being provided or how the information is going to be used, or, any of those kinds of details would be helpful.
Mary Beth, are you there? Okay, maybe I should have double checked that Mary Beth was back before we posed those questions to her. Mary Beth, are you there or having trouble with your microphone? All right, sorry about that, Greg. We'll circle back around with Mary Beth. Jacob, maybe if you could just put a little note in the chat pod so Mary Beth can see that when she comes back that we do have a question for her, and then ask her to just let us know when she's back in. We can pick that up in a moment. So this afternoon's discussion is going to be around the topic of promoting and conducting public meetings. And I think, all of us here probably by this point, well a year or more into a pandemic, have had some sort of experiences with public meetings. One thing I did want to point out or sort of emphasize is that, the Federal Highway Administration does have requirements regarding virtual public hearings that are required for the National Environmental Policy Act. So I just wanted to make that distinction between other types of public hearings that may be required under your state law or other types of statutes and regulations, but specifically for NEPA required public hearings, perhaps as a part of an environmental impact statement. Those public hearings, FHWA has temporary guidance in place that says that, yes, you can do completely virtual public hearings during this pandemic, this emergency. Again, that guidance is temporary. And so, once the pandemic is officially over, we will revert back to our original stance on public hearings, which is that there must always be an in-person component. And this is really to protect and include those individuals who may not have access to or the ability to access the virtual technology. And Carolyn Nelson from FHWA and also Tina Hooper will be talking about this a little bit more on the, I think it's the third day of our agenda, how to conduct virtual public meetings and use VPI in a manner that's consistent with being equitable and inclusive. So I just wanted to point that out. It looks like we have Mary Beth back with us.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to ask, and I apologize, Greg, for you to repeat your question tonight.
No worries, not a problem at all. So, Mary Beth, this is Greg Sapchinsky from MassDOT, and during your presentation, you mentioned that one of the things you make available at virtual public meetings is a link to have attendees take a demographic survey. And I'm curious about, whether you can share any information now about, how that survey has been received by the public, what the response rate tends to be, how that response rate maybe compares in the virtual context to in-person meetings, if you were using a similar survey prior to doing virtual meetings. And even just what the perception has been from members of the public who are asked to take that survey, whether there's been questions about how the data is going to be used and those kinds of things.
I don't think the response rate was as successful as we probably wanted it to be. But I don't have as much information. I'll get that information from our contract compliance office, who actually gathers that data, and get it back to you. I don't really have that answer right now, but I will get some information. I know that, giving up numbers, I don't say we had 20 people attend, we might have only had 5 people sign that demographic. It didn't get used very often, but I will get more information from the contract compliance staff and provide that to you.
I appreciate that. Thank you. That'd be helpful.
Great, thank you. Mary Beth, I didn't realize you hadn't come back yet from the break, but I just wanted to acknowledge your great presentation earlier, which was, just as polished as if it had been recorded. So, all right, you're welcome. So in this segment, we really wanted to talk a little bit more, and this was a subject raised of interest to our state DOT partners. And so we'll start here, but feel free to introduce some related questions or elements on the topic of promoting and conducting public meetings. So some of the things that have already been mentioned in both the opening remarks from Nina and from Andrea, and also in the presentations from our state DOTs, is this move toward having sort of hybrid meetings. But there are definite challenges to conducting virtual meetings in general, but then an additional layer when it comes to hybrid meetings. So maybe we'll start out with the question of, how are you promoting your public meetings now, especially the virtual ones? Are you exploring and using new promotional methods? And given what you're using or what you're doing, what have you found to be effective or ineffective? So I think our state DOTs, Massachusetts, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Connecticut have sort of touched on these topics, but maybe just very briefly, and we'll sort of start with Scott, since I see you popped up. Scott, if you want to talk about that briefly.
Sure, Alana. And like I said, for all of our virtual public meetings now, and which is all of our project development public meetings, we are doing the social media aspect. So our folks are putting it on Facebook, Twitter, putting it out there so that people see that in their feed, and it links right to that meeting. We also, in our notices that go out in the paper, which we still have to do, and the notices to abutters that we still do, we have that link. And that one page is nice because they can go on that one page, see the live meetings, link to the ones that might be already archived, but they can then see those. But definitely that getting it on Facebook, we're getting a lot more people seeing those meetings than probably would have before, reading it in ad in the back of the paper, or just those folks that would have received it prior. And we're also working on some other ways that we just had a bunch of discussions back and forth yesterday about public access TV and some of these local stations, and actually getting some of these put on those so that people can see the videos that we're producing on that. We're also coming up with a one-page flyer with a link to, that would have a link to our meeting, or a QR code, so that people can take their phone, snap a picture of that QR code, and go right into that. And the plan is to get those into some public places like libraries or other places where people are, so that they can just, anywhere they are, they see that, link them to that one page so they can do it. Not a specific to a project, but to any of the virtual projects.
That's really interesting. I see Mac, you have your hand raised, and then we'll go to Derek next.
Yeah, it's kind of tying into the question, I guess the answer about the sponsored social media, and I'm just wondering how many of you all use the sponsored social media for advertisements, maybe like the geofencing or the geolocating and targeted advertisement for the public within a specific region. Have you all used that aspect of social media?
Yeah, and Mac, I'll just add to what I said. This is Scott again from Maine, that we have where we can either choose kind of a 10 square mile area around a project is kind of the smallest area, or we could choose all the communities in a corridor. We've got some projects that we've chosen statewide to hit people, on Facebook and Twitter statewide, because of, we have one project coming up this fall that we're going to close part of the interstate for a while, for a weekend. So we're hitting that statewide and to keep pushing that. So yeah, you can target certain corridors or the whole statewide, and we find that, and it's very inexpensive to do that.
Okay.
Derek?
Yeah, thanks, Lana. So I would just echo what Scott said. We're also able to use social media a little bit differently now that we can provide links to all of what we do, and project web pages have actual recordings of all of our meetings. So in that sense, we're able to not only promote the meetings that are happening, but also promote meetings that have happened and encourage folks to comment on those even after the fact. I'll also say that in addition to some of the normal channels, we've been using some materials we have in Massachusetts, like we have kind of billboards around the state that we are able to digitally display some meetings. We've done that for our capital investment plan in the past. Our transit agency in Greater Boston, the MBTA, also has what are called digital panels in some of their stations, so we're able to display some advertisements for public meetings on those as well. So we're trying to take advantage of all those different resources that we have. We've talked about coordinating with other transit agencies, maybe putting flyers and things like that on buses and in our Registry of Motor Vehicles office. Not a ton has changed in that front since the pandemic. We were doing that, but I'd say the biggest difference is that we're now able to also share the meetings that have already happened and links for those meetings. So I'll just say, anyone else, I see a few other folks from MassDOT on the call, so feel free to chime in if you have anything else to add. And apologies for any background noise. We're having some work done at the house today, so thank you.
Yeah, and I don't know if folks are also monitoring all the comments or feedback that's coming into our Poll Everywhere poll, but it's interesting. I see so much of the sort of hybrid combination of methods of outreach now, both the social media, but still using, those things that make sense, right? Like, if you have town listservs, making sure that you contact your town representatives and make sure that your emails are sent out. So lower tech options, sort of traditional options, as well as the sort of newer options for outreach and getting the word out. I do wonder, and if Lucy or Catherine and also Mary Beth want to chime in here, if you're using these combinations of approaches, are you also sort of looking at performance metrics, seeing how many people are coming to these virtual meetings or our meetings, coming from seeing the notice on the bus or coming from an email link, so that you have an idea, is it worth it to continue getting the word out using this method versus that one? Should we concentrate more on these methods? I think that's also an interesting question.
This is Lucy here from New Hampshire DOT. I think like everybody has said, everybody's using a variety of different, social media and additional media sources, newspaper and all that. We're certainly, looking at the hybrid approach and, like traditionally when we have meetings, we have attendance sheets and things of that nature. So I think as this process evolves, we're having more and more virtual meetings. It will be avenues to, basically collect some of that information, the data, who's there, why they're there and all of that. So I think that, as I said, along with everybody else, I think we're all trying to do new things and see how it all works and move forward based on some of the success and what didn't work and see how that improved that as well.
And in Connecticut, yes, we've used all those methods too. We put flyers on the buses, in the trains, brochures that we sent out to all the libraries, news releases to all our interested parties. So we've done all that. We also did the Twitter and the Instagram. We've tried a lot of different, but we've never really, what you just said, never really looked at the matrix of how people found, a lot of times when you send out a survey, they don't answer it. So how do we get them to even answer the question? When they would come into in an in-person meeting, we'd have a attendance sheet. We would have a sign there that says, how did you hear about the meeting? And because we want to know, did you get an email? Did you hear word of mouth? Did you see a newspaper ad? And so they just wouldn't check that off. So still, I think it's a great idea to get that answer, but how to get the answer is probably more difficult.
Yeah, and,
Oh, go ahead, Catherine.
and it's the same in Vermont. Like we haven't actually kind of measured, I believe, the kind of like how efficient we are at reaching people right now. I think it's more about trying out different methods. Really a key one for us is using the regional planning commissions. So they're kind of like our local arm in terms of knowing the local networks, both in terms of social media and as well as other methods to reach out. That's really important for us.
Right, so I think we've heard from our state DOTs. I still want to open it up to our local agencies, the COGS and MPOs, RPOs. Are any of you having, experiences with this type of outreach? And do any of you have a way of or suggestions for measuring or sort of keeping track of how people learn about your meetings and which outreach methods are being most successful for you? And again, feel free to unmute and just speak out. Well, maybe let me ask a slightly different question. Are there specific challenges that you've been finding in sort of getting the word out there? Or are any of these methods that you've been hearing about, both that you saw being listed in the poll everywhere, but also you're hearing about from Scott and Derek and Catherine and Mary Beth, that you'd be interested in trying now? Oh, hey, Jake. Go ahead.
Hi. So my question may be a little bit off track, but I'm interested in hearing anybody's experiences on the effectiveness of online translation software or services. That's kind of one of the areas we've struggled with, is how do we make our public meetings accessible in different languages?
Great. Thank you so much, Jay. That's a great question. Mary Beth, I wonder if you have some insight into this. I know that was something that you took into consideration when choosing your virtual platform.
Yes, when we were looking at the platforms, we wanted to make sure we had translation services, and that's why we went to the Teams live event, because they did allow you to pick several languages. And what we did in-house is we asked people that spoke other languages if they could watch a presentation and see how accurate it was. And so Spanish was accurate enough that people could follow it. We had one woman that spoke Polish and she said it wasn't accurate at all. So we try to use that also as a way to figure out what's the best way to go. That's still an issue we have to resolve, is how to handle translation, because sometimes those translation services aren't the greatest. So that's what we did, but, and we hadn't got any complaints, so. The thing is, we don't know either if people actually use the translation services or if it was there, but it wasn't used. How do we track that also? So that is what we did. We had people that spoke the language at least watch a presentation and see if it was close enough that it would at least hit. And you know, with Spanish, there's more than one dialect, so which one is it going to? So it was successful in that way, but again, we probably didn't have as many people using it as you would hope they would use it.
Tina. Tina, are you unmuted?
I am trying, thank you. Oh, I was just dying to chime in on this conversation. You know, we're going to talk about this a little bit more next week regarding translation services and providing equitable decision-making opportunities to members of the community. So I did take a note, Jay, to make sure that we address this next week. Thank you.
One thing that I would like to ask Volpe, Jacob, and Lurs and Kevin, because you know, often when we have these large like webinars or other things, Volpe is the one that arranges for our you know, closed captioning, or we haven't really done translations for our webinars and so on, but I did want to ask Volpe about their experiences and expertise in this area.
I can start, I would say, with webinars and these peer exchanges. We don't have too much experience with kind of translation. I would say with closed captioning, obviously a little bit different. I don't know if people are aware, but Teams now has a feature where you're able to turn on live captions during both Teams live events and just Teams meetings. So if you're interested in trying that out now, it's a relatively accurate feature, and it's kind of very useful if you're just kind of a very affordable and built-in way to kind of meet the needs of individuals with disabilities. I think we can do a kind of a little more research on our end to see if there are kind of any other services we're aware of for translation. But none come to mind kind of off the top of my head.
I guess sorry, is that Kevin or Max speaking up?
Yeah, it's Kevin. Sorry, I was trying to unmute there. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, just to add on to some more of what Jacob said, essentially, like to add in like live translation services is a little more complicated and usually involves kind of having someone who is connected to the audio feed and then can provide a separate audio feed. It doesn't necessarily go through the same platform, so someone would have to connect to a different audio feed in order to get that live translation. And that also goes for American Sign Language. You can provide that service, but it might not necessarily be through the same window, like the same Teams interface. It might be a separate window that someone would connect to. So it does involve additional steps, but it's something that Federal Highways and USDOT in general is really trying to improve our capabilities on. And you may have noticed that when we send out the meeting invite for this and for other events, we're now specifically asking if anyone needs accommodations, language translation or other accommodations, that they please let us know in advance so that we can do as much as we can to be prepared to provide those services. So trying to be more proactive about that. But I think Federal Highways as an agency and USDOT as a whole is really trying to kind of increase our capabilities and make that more of a standard practice.
Yeah, and I guess one last point before we sort of move on from this topic is it's obviously not the same as having a live translation, but this is maybe an area where the recording afterwards, or a prepared recording where you can layer on subtitles in different languages, or separate audio streams, translations in different languages, could be a useful tool as well. That may be a little bit more approachable than, or at least a first step in terms of gradually moving toward having sort of in real time, other language support in your meetings.
Another thing I'll mention is for those kinds of meetings that are more structured as an online meeting, not necessarily something that happens in real time, but something that is like structured for people to experience at their own pace. We have seen agencies develop that same online meeting experience in another language. You know, for example, I believe the Alamo area MPO in San Antonio, Texas, they have a large Spanish-speaking population. And so when they do an online meeting, they have a Spanish language version of it and they have an English language version of it. It's exactly the same material, accessible in both languages. So if you have, you know, a significant population that needs the information in another language, I'm sure you're already doing that for your website, and you can apply those same practices to anything that you're structuring in your website, including more of like a virtual meeting experience.
All right, so thanks, Jay, for a great question. As Tina said, we're going to revisit this next Tuesday when we talk a little bit more about equitable access to the transportation decision-making process using VPI tools. So I want to touch on another question that has been brought up, maybe more so in the past when we all had a little less experience using virtual platforms and holding virtual meetings. You may remember in the early days of the pandemic when suddenly everybody was using Zoom and you heard about Zoom bombing and things like that. So sometimes, and maybe still, security is a question or an issue. You know, how do you make sure that you have people who you intend to participate, be in the room, and you know, how do you manage potentially contentious meetings? You know, whether it's just because you know it may be a contentious project, or it could be because you know somebody's intentionally coming in to disrupt things. So you know, again we'll start with our state DOTs, but you know, at any point, any of our local partners, please raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you. I think you may also have experiences with this. So let's start with Lucy. Lucy, are you there?
Yes, I am here. I have myself had not had any experience doing that. I know in talking with some of our RPCs, they have had that experience. So I didn't know if any of them were willing to share, and I won't put anyone on the spot, but I think that's certainly a concern when you have any public meeting is, you know, if you have somebody who's there and who's going to disrupt the meeting for a variety of reasons, that how do you address that? But I myself have not had an opportunity to conduct the meeting and had that experience. So if anyone else wants to chime in, that would be appreciated.
Yeah, and I think, you know, certain platforms in recognition of, and it seems like every month they're pushing out new features. So platforms have recognized that this can be a challenge and introduced new features. And so I wonder if any of you have experience with those, can maybe not recommend, but let us know about certain features that may help with that. So I think, okay, go ahead, Scott.
Yeah, I mean, are you done, Lana? Okay. Yeah, and you know, one main reason we decided to go with the on-demand and not the live was really a big part of it is a big part of Maine does not have great connections. So we wanted to make sure that it was something that people could go on, see it, and not just people that might on their own have bad connections, but also for our staff. If all of a sudden we had where, you know, so-and-so can't connect and, you know, where you're counting on them to talk. So we did the on-demand, and if someone even at their home, if they lose connection for a little while, they can come back at another time when they have connection and watch it. They can watch that video and see the information at any time. And another part of it too was that conscious decision of not having the Zoom bombing or any of those other issues with that. And the other part of it is too that by doing the videos beforehand, we can review them and we can make sure we're controlling the message. We're putting our message out there. If we mess up, I know sometimes some of us may have been at public meetings and maybe realize we said something we shouldn't have to the public. And this way we can make sure we're putting the right message out there. And as far as the meeting itself and controlling the meeting where it's on demand and people make those comments, they go into the system of the application, we respond back to them. So other people don't see those comments. So you're making your own comment. You're not grandstanding for other people to hear and then jump on and have kind of like the whole chat room of Facebook or something, comment section, so that, you know, we're getting back to those people on the comments that they have and not having that type of grandstanding. So that's a main reason why we went with it for, you know, a couple varied reasons to do that.
Yeah, great point, Scott. And I also saw that in one of the responses to the poll is that it's important to set the tone for public discourse. I guess this is true whether it's in person or virtually, but just to, you know, for example, if you're going to allow people like a minute or 2 minutes to make their comment and speak, that it's understood that, you know, we may have to cut you off after 2 minutes to make it fair for everyone, that everybody has a chance to speak, to set the ground rules. For example, if you're going to, you know, start using offensive language or, you know, other unacceptable behaviors, that we will, you know, boot you out. And there are platforms that give you the ability to remove.
I think we might have lost Lana temporarily, but oh, Lana, are you back? I think we lost you for a second.
Yeah, it was just briefly. Yeah, I wanted to ask Catherine to, she has her hand up, so.
Yeah, there are a few things that we do, particularly we have a separate person online who will help to admit people in a meeting, even if it's a meeting which is like pretty small and we know that most of it we can handle on our own. We definitely have someone on the side to do like the IT side, and we actually keep the waiting room, even if it is a larger meeting, because it gives us the ability to throw someone out if we need. We've never had to use it, but it's really nice to have that reassurance. And we're also, like I see for this meeting, that it's separated into presenters and attendees, and I use that a lot because it means you can very immediately mute everyone who's an attendee, and it's unlikely that your presenters are going to do something kind of like off the roll, and it doesn't give them the ability to like share their screen without the ability. And so those small things in Teams have prevented things from happening. We've had nothing bad has happened yet, but at least we have those safeguards in place. And another thing is, like, sometimes, like, I like your idea, Lana, about like having a time limit. I think that is important. I've definitely been in a meeting where unfortunately we chased down the rabbit hole very in a not great way, and it would have been good to be able to pull back and say, look, we need to move on. One thing I sometimes use if I'm hearing silence, like I'm actually not getting feedback, is I start saying, can we use the hand raising tool? I'm going to ask you some questions. So it's almost like doing an ad hoc poll instead of me having to have already created it and someone having to work out the technology. The hand raise tool is pretty easy to find compared to other things. And so sometimes I said, well, I'm not hearing, does this silence mean that you're all good for it or not? Like, let's go through some options. Raise your hand if you're good with this. Raise your hand if you're like, I'm not sure, I need some more information. And I found that that sometimes helped to spark the conversation and also move things along if it's silence, which I think is almost as hard as contention where everything's being thrown at you, because silence doesn't tell you if they agree or if they really don't agree and don't feel like they're going to be heard.
Great point. I also see just showing up here in the EV poll that, you know, if you're hearing the same comment or the same negative comment, you know, maybe ask if there are new questions or comments. And I think these are strategies that we try to employ in general, whether, you know, even if you were in an in-person meeting, to try and just keep the conversation flowing and having, you know, additional people sharing. Yeah, so Joanna's talking about having the support of 1 or 2 additional members. So definitely, and I think this is something we're going to slowly transitioning over into talking about, you know, strategies for public meetings and large public meetings in general, is yes, there can be, you know, sort of cost savings involved in having virtual meetings versus in-person meetings. But it's important to realize that, you know, maybe your staff don't have to travel as much, or maybe they don't have to, you know, don't have to spend as much money on sort of print out billboards and, you know, sort of things like that you would have set up in an in-person meeting. But there's just as much planning, if not more, involved in holding a successful virtual public meeting. And, you know, for this peer exchange, you know, I wasn't joking when I said we were been planning this for almost 2 years. Of course, we had to, you know, transition from planning in person to virtual, but, you know, sort of dry runs and practicing and making sure that everybody, at least your main speakers and facilitators, are comfortable with all the features, know what they can do and should do. And having the support as we do here with Jacob and Larissa and Kevin, you know, a couple of people whose sole responsibility it is to respond in case there are any issues, to monitor the chat pods and hand raising and all of that, because yes, it is such a great help. Any other thoughts on this topic or challenges? You know, well, what challenges have you experienced in conducting really large virtual meetings? Yeah, so that's a good point. Just, you know, if you do have disruptions, to acknowledge it, apologize for any interruptions, but, you know, to kind of bring things back on track. And I see, Jay, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Unmute myself. We have been Zoom bombed in public meetings. I think one of the challenges in public meetings is that you can't exclude anyone. So using the waiting room function or some of these other tools, aren't helpful. But so we have been Zoom bombed. I think it's actually not been as much of a problem lately. It's almost always pornographic. And we have had to end meetings. I've been in a couple of meetings that we simply had to end it because they were able to put imagery across our screen. That was, upsetting for people. That hasn't been as much of a problem lately. But otherwise, I would say I've seen much more disruptive behavior in in-person meetings than I have online. I think people are less likely to act in ways that are disruptive. Certainly, we don't have, people yelling out objections, applauding or groaning or booing. I've seen all that activity happen in in-person meetings. And sometimes it becomes the tone of the meeting. People encourage each other, that kind of thing. So that I see actually a whole lot less of. It may change over time. I will say there's a downside to that also, in that I think my experience has been, and again, this could change, people are less likely to engage online. I think there's a real reluctance to do what I just did, raise my hand and make a comment. And you're not sure if it's okay, or are there other people, or, is what you're saying stupid and it's going to be recorded. So, I think it's a mixed bag. I think it's evolving. But just in general, I don't find, virtual public meetings to be more of a challenge when it comes to disruptive behavior.
Jay, I'm curious, what meeting platform were you using when so you were using Zoom, or have you
Yes.
used other ones as well?
We've used multiple ones, but in the case of where we were Zoom bombed, it was in fact Zoom. I think they've put some controls in place to make that easier. And I think in these cases it was, or I should say to make that more difficult, and it wasn't participants in the meeting. So how they hijacked our meeting, we don't really know. And in those cases, they seemed to hijack the screen when presentations were, happening.
Some people are shy, and whether it's in person or online, I won't feel comfortable just unmuting and speaking. But it becomes ever so much more difficult if you have 300 attendees or 500. And so we did try to keep the number of attendees to a manageable number. But, in terms of breakout rooms specifically, we will be doing breakout rooms using the Teams breakout feature in the third session. And, it kind of depends on what activity you're planning to have in that breakout room, and also sort of the skill of your facilitators within that breakout room. But I think we are aiming for our breakout rooms to sort of have 20 or so, maybe a little fewer people in each breakout, because you know, it's going to be a group activity. You're going to be having some discussions and working on a worksheet together. And so, you know, if you just think about even in person, if you start having like 30 people in a breakout room, you know, there definitely be people who sort of sit back and won't engage as much. And we wanted to keep it as engaging as possible. Any other thoughts on this? Please raise your hand and speak up. Catherine.
So one of the best practices that I've learned with breakout rooms is to always have one of the breakout rooms being the main room, because there are always going to be people who have technological problems. And even if you've assigned them to a room, just if they're having problems, just allow them to stay in the main room and they can still participate in a discussion. That's just, it's helped. I've been working with the same group every month for the last year, and there are some people who just always have technological problems, and sometimes it's just literally their phone is not misbehaving today, and so it's just a helpful practice.
Thank you. Let's see. There've been a couple of long comments in the chat pod. So Michael is just pointing out some additional updates that Zoom has made with, there's a security button. So, you know, please go ahead and read that comment. I think that's very useful to know. And then Mary Beth put some information about Connecticut DOT's contract compliance response to demographic surveys. So I think there had been some questions regarding her the Connecticut DOT's demographic surveys, you know, coming from the earlier part of the session. So I wanted to make sure that you know, people saw that as well. I see Catherine, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Sorry, I forgot to put it down.
Oh, okay. That's all right. Yeah, and I think that was a really great tip, Catherine. That was something that, you know, when we were planning for this peer exchange that you brought up, and I thought that was a great tip. And just so folks know, we are planning to, at least with our presenter from Utah DOT, we are doing dry runs to practice the breakout feature. Mac and I had experience with the Teams breakout features very early on when they first rolled it out, and it was a little glitchy. So we're hoping that, you know, now that it's been several months since they first rolled it out, that it will go more smoothly. But I think Catherine's suggestion that we make the main room one of the breakout rooms is really important, because one of the issues that Mac and I found early on was that for some reason certain individuals were not getting, you know, pushed into the breakout rooms, and so they got stuck in the original room. So Catherine's tip would you know, make that not a problem. Okay, so I know, you know, we just have a couple more minutes before we're going to sort of wrap up today's session. But one of the things that several of our state DOT partners brought up is this concept of the hybrid meetings. And I think that's something that, you know, many or not most of us are thinking about now is, you know, as people start getting more comfortable with the thought of coming back to in person, and some people have a definite preference for engaging in person. How do we combine all these things that we've learned to conduct hybrid meetings, which layer an additional level of complexity? Even if I just think about returning to the office, those members of staff who are still working remotely versus the ones in the room, how do you make sure that, you know, instead of everybody sitting in front of a computer, some people are in a room and some people are on the computer, how do you make sure that that sense of, you know, integrated engagement is still there? So, you know, state DOTs or MPOs, COGS, what are some of the questions that you're struggling with when it comes to hybrid meetings? James.
Hello. Yeah. So, with the Southern New Hampshire Planning Commission, and we've recently invested in some specialized equipment that allows us to pan a camera across the entire room, and for specialized audio equipment that picks up voices across the room. So there's multiple microphones basically and multiple speakers. And that way we just have clear audio from every participant that is in physically present. And that translates really well into a virtual platform. And so that, we have to let people know when they're physically present that no matter what they say, it's going to be picked up by the microphone. So be wary of the things you're saying, under your breath to your neighbor. It's going to get picked up. It's going to be recorded and posted on YouTube. So, and that seems to be working really well, although we've only had a couple meetings using this new equipment.
So, James, would you mind sharing, in the chat pod, maybe for those who would be interested in looking to this, what, specifically you use? I'm sure there are plenty of other ones as well. And I see, Sarah, you have your hand up. Oh, you need to unmute yourself, Sarah.
Okay,
Sarah?
can we hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Sorry, calling in on my phone. One thing I found really helpful when we started to think about hybrid meetings was drawing it out. So just put it on the screen. The presenters are going to be over here. There's going to be a camera there, a microphone there. It was really helpful to visualize it so you could understand how people are going to participate and where everyone's going to be in the room. It feels like a simple suggestion, but we found it incredibly helpful.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a really great idea. So thanks for bringing that up. So I see a couple of people talking about an owl. I'm not familiar with this. Does anybody want to unmute and just talk about this one really briefly?
I can. So it kind of actually looks like a little owl, and it sits in the center. So say if you're meeting, you want to kind of put it in the center where everyone's seated, and it physically will turn to the person that's talking. So if I'm talking, the camera will hear my audio and turn and face me. And then if someone else starts talking, I'll turn and face them. And I think it also has a panoramic component. So when you're doing the hybrid meetings, the people on Zoom they have a picture of the entire room. And then they also have within that a smaller picture of who's talking in the moment. So it's kind of cool. And you can also on like a device like an iPad physically control it if you want to like focus in on one person or something. But we've only had, I think, 2 meetings with it so far. So we're still kind of learning how to use it, but it's really cool technology.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think, now that it makes sense that they call it an owl and it's very cute. I think I participated in a meeting with some consultants. Obviously, they had a much different budget than the federal agency has. So at the time, it was like, ooh, this is really cool and spiffy. But hopefully with, the increased need, the prices for those types of instruments have been coming down. So yeah, I see a lot of comments in the chat pod about that. So Derek, I saw you pop on with your camera. Were you going to say something?
No, I must have just come into your screen. But yeah, I have heard about the owl. And I know a lot of our regional planning agencies in Massachusetts are beginning to use this, as folks have mentioned in the chat. So we're planning on adding some information to this as part of our training materials. And so whatever we find folks are having success with, that's something we're going to put into our guidance as well.
Okay, great, thanks. Thank you everyone for engaging in this conversation and discussion. It's really interesting to hear. We've had the opportunity at the state DOTs to share a little bit over the course of the past 2 years on what each other are doing. So it's really interesting and helpful to hear from those of you in the RPOs and the COGs and the NPOs as well. I want to turn things over to Mac and Jacob and Larissa, since they've been furiously taking notes, and I know Jacob has another poll question for you all. So we're going to wrap up today's session with some key takeaways. And what were your key takeaways? So as you're sort of putting information into there, you know, Mac, maybe you'd like to lead us through this?
Sure. So I've been vigorously taking notes on all the awesome information you all been presenting today. So I guess I have I'll kind of run down the list and mention a few key topic areas, and kind of as I'm discussing it, you can input your key takeaways, in the poll.ev that's pulled up on your screen. But in general, we had a great discussion from Mass DOT. Very interesting about their VPI training for their staff. Find it very useful that they have scripts and checklists and example notices in different languages. I think I saw a couple comments also in the chat box about this Mass DOT 100 series training. Got a link to their Mass DOT guidelines for virtual public involvement. The Engage tool, so that also came up a few times. The fact that they were able to use census data, it shows transit stops, it shows where projects are actually happening within the region. The PIMA tool, so that came up a couple times from Mass DOT, I think as well as Maine DOT. But again, we got a little bit more detail about that tool and how it could display online content, comment forms, and it has a mapping function, as well as project managers. The key part, project managers being able to respond to members of the public. Again, we heard a little bit from Maine DOT regarding their meeting links for their on-demand public meetings. Essentially, they also use the PIMA tool application. Again, they're able to obtain metrics, seeing how many people are clicking, shows the engagement, which I think we've asked this question before. I think it's a great question to try to drill down to analyze what tool is most effective. And understanding which tool is most effective within your subset of population that you're trying to reach, or within the public that you're trying to reach within your state. So it sounds like you're able to obtain some metrics and data.
Yeah, sorry. Oh, okay.
All right. Also, New Hampshire DOT talked a little bit about their MetroQuest survey tool. And also their NEPA public involvement manual, the fact that it includes a virtual public involvement component. Vermont DOT with their Route 9 corridor management plan, highlighting that virtual public involvement is essential for their success. I think something interesting is that came out of Connecticut DOT's presentation about their Teams Live event, that they had a producer and they recognize the importance of having a facilitator and a producer of those events to make sure that there were no technological difficulties as the meeting was presented. We had I saw a few comments in the chat box about the splash screen. Everyone likes the splash screen. The fact that it helps keep people engaged. They use it 15 minutes before the meeting starts. And specifically for the project they were highlighting, they use that splash screen to know if there are any technical difficulties or issues with the meeting. Those are the majority of the highlights. And, we got into a very deep discussion about, again, how effective is your specific public involvement technique? How are you promoting your meetings? We talked a little about the geolocating our sponsored social media advertisements, combination of approaches, and the combination, we've hit this a couple of times, the combination of the in-person and the virtual public involvement aspect. These were a lot of the major key components. And I think we look forward to expanding upon these as we continue to move forward through day one and into day two. Yes. Did anyone else have any extra highlights? I think I've covered the majority of the ones that are popping up on the poll.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear that people sort of got the main messages, that there are a lot of tools out there for you. Definitely contact your state DOT, your Mass DOT, if you are interested in particular things that you heard about today. There are, very many ways to accomplish what you need to in terms of public involvement using virtual tools. And so I just wanted to, one, thank you all again But two, we have a couple of things regarding next Tuesday's session, which we'll be talking about more specifically how to use virtual tools to reach traditionally underserved communities and ensure equitable engagement in the transportation decision-making process. And we will have homework for you. So Carolyn Nelson is the Federal Highway Administration's headquarters, one of our main subject matter experts on the topics of public involvement and environmental justice and equity. So she did do a webinar presentation last month, I believe, and we have a recording from that. And so we'll send you a link to that recording. We just ask that you please watch that before you come to the meeting. And so in the live session next week, then you'll have an opportunity to engage with Carolyn and also Tina Hooper from our Office of Civil Rights, who will be happy to answer questions, more specific questions that you may have, and sort of help us facilitate a conversation around those topics. So please keep an eye out for that email with the link and watch the recording before we meet again next week. All right. So everyone, thank you so much for your participation. I think it was great discussions that we've been having, and we'll see you next week. Have a great day.
All right. Bye, everyone.